it's possible that at some point, some of you have heard me say that in my own personal theology, in my own personal understanding of who God is, that I, talking about myself, that I cannot allow for the possibility that there is a hell. And by that, I mean hell as a place beyond this life of eternal divine punishment. Now, I certainly believe in the existence of evil. It doesn't take us too much to be able to see that indeed there is evil in the world. But just as I certainly believe in the existence of evil, I also believe in the existence of love and mercy and compassion. And I believe those things shall indeed win the day. I believe that each person, unfortunately, does endure at some point in their life suffering, their own hells from time to time. But at no time do I believe that these periods of suffering are ever caused by or serve as some form of punishment from God. In fact, often the sufferings that human beings endure, I believe, is caused by humans themselves. Sometimes they are self-inflicted, and sometimes they are a result and at the hands of other people. I cannot embrace a God who punishes with eternal damnation. A humanity that is said to be loved so unconditionally, so extremely. Why not? Because I believe in grace. Because I have hope in the idea of grace, God's grace. Because I believe grace is true and real, and it is at the core of God's purpose and identity. Now, in their book, If Grace is True, Pastors Philip Gulley and James Mulholland define grace as God's unfailing commitment to love. God's unfailing commitment to love. God has made a commitment, a sacred covenant to love humanity, to love each one of us. And as Paul writes to the Romans, there is nothing that will ever separate us from the love, from the grace of God. For me, in order for grace to be true, for Paul to be right, there is no eternal divine punishment such as hell. Now, not everyone agrees with me, and I am okay with that. Each person is to work out their own understanding with God, of God, in their own way. And those who have challenged me on my belief, or perhaps my disbelief is a better way of looking at it, have suggested that to not believe in hell is an easy way out. That to not believe in hell lacks some form of accountability and even removes the need for a person to follow in the ways of Jesus. If there's no hell, they said, then why even bother at all? Why bother to live a good and faithful life? Well, those are fair questions and observations, I believe, but I don't try. The key word here is try. I don't try to live a good and faithful life simply because God threatens me or hangs over my head some form of divine retribution. I try to live a fair and just and good life simply because that's a good way to live. The threat of divine retribution is not what holds me accountable. My understanding of who God is and how God is revealed, that is what holds me accountable. Holds me accountable to God and holds me accountable to my fellow human beings. Now, as for the need to follow Jesus, again, that is a personal decision that everyone should make and needs to make on their own. I made the decision to follow the ways of Jesus decades ago because through Jesus, it is through Jesus that I wanted to know more about God and God's nature. It was through Jesus that I have come to know of God's love. It is through Jesus that I have come to know of God's mercy and God's compassion. It is through Jesus that I have come to know what God's grace looks like and feels like, and how freely it has been given. Which tells us something powerful about God. That grace is given freely. That grace is given abundantly and extravagantly and even scandalously. Grace and the way it is expressed, this unfailing commitment to love, is one of those things, I believe, that makes God, God, and makes humans, human. Because let me ask you something. Have you ever tried to extend grace to someone? Have you ever tried to extend true grace to another person? Is giving grace easy? Is it an easy thing to do? Is your commitment to love another person, especially a person who has hurt you or disappointed you or caused you harm, is that love for that person unfailing? Have you ever tried to extend grace to another person or even to yourself? Grace and that unfailing commitment to love means being able to let go. It's like exhaling that deep breath that Pastor Josh had us take during the centering prayer. When you inhale deeply, you're all tense and bottled up and filled up. Your muscles can ache. And then when you let it out, there's relief. You let go. That's grace. Letting go. Grace is the forget part of forgive and forget. Grace is the forget part of forgive and forget. It means that you are willing and able to let go and not hold over the head as emotional or spiritual punishment the action or inaction of another person. Grace is love and forgiveness embodied. Love plus forgiveness equals grace. And while only God has perfected unfailing love, each one of us are called as followers of the ways and teachings of Jesus to take up the challenge of grace. Take up the challenge of extending grace. Take up the challenge of being graceful and grace-filled in all of our relationships. Now this morning we have a familiar story. A wealthy father has two sons. The youngest son comes to the father and demands his inheritance. Give me 1/3 of the value of all that is yours. Give me 1/3, the 1/3 that's going to come to me, so that I can go, I can leave home, and I can live life on my own terms. Now, as brash and as arrogant as that is, it is important to know that that is even more so than it sounds. And even more offensive than it sounds. Because what the son is really saying to the father is, Dad, I wish you were dead. I wish you were dead so I could take what is mine and just go on and live my life. There's no argument from the father. There's no pushback. The prodigal's demands are fulfilled, and he takes his newfound wealth. He leaves town, and he forsakes everything that he has ever known and has ever been taught. It is not until this youngest son hits rock bottom, literally finding himself among the pigs, that he has this awakening that even the lowest servant who works for his father has more than an abundance of food to eat. I have to go home, he said. I have to go home. I have to go home, and I have to beg for forgiveness. So he does. The son seeks forgiveness. And what he receives from his father is just that, forgiveness. And then some, because he also receives grace. Now, it would be a beautiful story if it ended right there. Father and son reunited. There's a big party. There's music. There's dancing. There's fancy clothes. The son is dressed like royalty. It has all the makings of a great movie with a happy ending, except, dun, 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 there is the older brother. The one who stuck around. The one who continued to labor under his father working in the field while the younger brother went off and blew the inheritance. Hearing the news of his brother's return and his father's extravagant plans, the eldest son is livid, and some would say rightfully so. He feels cheated that his little punk brother gets the best of everything, while he has been loyal and has remained and worked hard. The party, this new party, is going to eat into his inheritance. Anybody else have older siblings? This part about the older brother is probably the most important part of our text this morning, because it brings the whole 15th chapter of Luke to a full circle. Do you remember how the text began this morning when Barb read it? The lectionary doesn't just give us the beginning of the parable. The lectionary wants us to hear, prior to Jesus' telling of the parable, the first two verses, because those first two verses provided much needed context. It began with sinners and tax collectors coming to Jesus to listen and to be taught by him. And with the so-called religious folk, the Pharisees and the scribes, the church-going folk, grumbling and complaining and getting mad because they think Jesus is wasting his time and his resources on them, the sinners and tax collectors. The sinners and tax collectors coming to Jesus, and the church folk get upset. The youngest son comes back home to his father, and the oldest son gets upset because he thinks his dad is wasting his time and the resources. It's always funny to me when the church folk get upset because time and energy is being spent on the lost and the wandering and the marginalized, rather than those who have been around working hard all this time. The reason all of these resources are being spent is because that is what Jesus told us to do. Jesus told us to spend our time and resources on those who are wandering and lost. That's what Jesus did. This whole chapter, this whole 15th chapter of Luke, is about finding and recovering what's been lost. Lost sheep, lost coins, lost son. And the extravagant time and energy that is spent recovering the one lost of many. The one lost thing, rather than spending all of your time and energy and resources on that which is right in front of you, the time, the energy, the faithfulness is spent searching for that which is lost. Upon his return, the father says to the eldest son, "Your brother was once lost, and now he has been found." And yet it seems as if the oldest son is the one who is lost. Because he doesn't understand the true meaning of grace. Sure, he's been there. He's been there working hard, remaining loyal, but in the end, he just doesn't get it. And he is so caught up. He gets so caught up in this self-created hell of self-pity and jealousy and pettiness. And it's destroying his spirit, y'all. It is destroying the spirit of the older brother. Because he doesn't truly believe in the power of God's grace. The grace that can free him, the grace that brings him salvation. Y'all, grace is challenging because some folk we think don't deserve it. But grace has this way of turning us inside out and upside down and shaking us to the very core of who we are. Grace is hard. Grace is hard, but it has nothing to do with deserve. Because grace is of God. But the challenge of grace has its own reward. By the way, we have mislabeled this story for centuries. We have called it the prodigal son because of the youngest son's behavior. But do you know what the word prodigal really means? It means to spend resources freely and recklessly. Prodigal means to be wastefully extravagant. It means to have or to give something on a lavish scale. It is a prodigal is a person who spends resources in an extravagant way. So maybe rather than calling this the prodigal son, this parable should be known probably as the prodigal father, or the prodigal parent, or the prodigal God. Because when you really think about it, this is not a parable about a son who goes off, spends extravagantly, blowing his father's inheritance. It is not a parable about the actions of a son. This is a parable about the grace of God. It is a parable about God's unfailing commitment to love. This is a parable about a parent and the great and the reckless and the extravagant measures that will be taken to forgive and to forget. This is a parable about God.